Hello, my name is Jennifer Hong. I'm the Project 2049 Senior Director. Thank you for joining us today on behalf of Project 2049 and our friends at the Worldwide Support for Development. We are so excited that you're here with us on a discussion on innovative policy options for strategic competition with China. We have distinguished guests here today. We have former Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott, with us today, with Honorable Chairman Randy Shriver of Project 2049, Deputy Director Shioko Goto from the Wilson Center. At this time, I will hand it over to my colleague Colby, who will be able to share some best housekeeping practices so that you will have the best viewing experience today. Colby, over to you.
Thanks, Jen. Welcome back, everyone. It's great to have you all back on our webinar series. After today's discussion, similar to our previous series, we'll open up the floor to a live audience Q&A for roughly the last 20 minutes of this 1 hour long session. So we hope to see your questions come in throughout the event. Actually, it's quite helpful to submit as early as possible so we can start to organize rather than a last minute crunch. So whenever you want, as early as now, you can submit. There are two ways to submit those questions. One, you can write them an email to ask@project2049.net. So it's ask@project2049.net. If you've RSVP'd in the last few weeks, I sent an email reminder that said 10 minutes to go. You can actually reply directly to that email and we'll get your questions logged in. For those of you watching on YouTube, option number 2, if you have a YouTube account, there's a live chat box with some messages in it. You can message our team those questions right there and we'll add them in. Last thing to note on this is please remember to include your name and affiliation when submitting questions, or else we'll have to go back and forth. So we'll prioritize questions by people who gave their name and affiliation. Thank you very much. Looking forward to a great event. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our chairman, Randall Shriver.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. We're really thrilled today to host such a distinguished group of visitors and very much look forward to the discussion. It's quite timely. The run of order here is we're going to have keynote remarks from Prime Minister Abbott, and then Goto-san is going to make a few comments and reactions. I'll do the same, and then we'll have a moderated question and answer period followed by your questions. So I have the now distinct honor and privilege of introducing our keynote speaker. People who don't need an introduction, we still like to give it to them so that we can highlight their very impressive backgrounds and careers. Former Prime Minister Tony Abbott was elected Prime Minister of Australia in September 2013. He served in that Prime Minister for 2 years and served further in the Parliament in Australia until 2019. He has a long and distinguished career of public service, great supporter of the alliance with the United States and partnership and friendship with Japan. Prior to his service in government, he was a journalist with the Australian and also a senior advisor to a former opposition leader. He has degrees from Sydney University. He was also a Rhodes Scholar from Oxford. So a very impressive background, as I said. We also learned today a little bit about his rugby skills. So I'm sure that comes in handy from time to time in politics, particularly in Australia. He's recently been traveling in the Indo-Pacific region, was recently in Taiwan, and now with us here in the Washington area to share observations about the Indo-Pacific region, Australia's view, and really to help us think about the future, as the title of this webinar implies. We're looking forward to hearing his ideas and discuss with him how we can strengthen the trilateral relationship and how we can think about the most pressing challenges in the Indo-Pacific. So, Prime Minister Abbott, thank you so much again for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Well, Randy, Jennifer, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here in Washington, D.C., and it's terrific to be at the Project 2049 Institute. I should also acknowledge Worldwide Support for Development and Dr. Handa, the distinguished Japanese philanthropist who has helped to sponsor this trip. Look, in a remarkably short space of time, probably over the space of about 5 or 6 years, China has gone from being an opportunity to a challenge to a threat. And right now, about $20 billion worth of Australian trade has been capriciously and arbitrarily stopped by China essentially because the Chinese want to punish us for various malefactions, most recently publicly calling for an independent and impartial international investigation into the Wuhan virus. So we do have a problem on our hands. We have a ruthless dictatorship which is aiming, in the words of its president, to be the world's top power, at least by 2049. And a big part of that is going to be taking back Taiwan as the next step. Obviously, any attempt by China to take back Taiwan as they see it will have enormous ramifications, ranging from the severe to the cataclysmic. And plainly, at some point in that process, relations between China and much of the rest of the world would be sundered. So what do we do? In the first instance, I think we need to reduce our vulnerability to China. That means trying to find alternative markets. It means trying to take China as far as is humanly possible out of our supply chains. And it means attempting to find alternative sources of strategic goods. Second, I think it means avoiding making ourselves weaker. And we do this in all sorts of ways. One of the ways where perhaps Australia has made itself weaker and more vulnerable is by accepting so many Chinese students, many of them under the sponsorship of the Beijing government, into our universities. About 20% of the students at my old alma mater, the University of Sydney, at least pre-pandemic, were from China. We make ourselves weaker every time we engage in the kind of cultural self-flagellation that we've seen so much of, particularly over the last 12 months. And while all of us obviously want to care for the planet and do what we can to reduce emissions, I worry about commitments we make and policies we adopt, which will make ourselves economically weaker when there is no commensurate commitment on emissions from China. And the third thing we need to do is to make ourselves stronger. And a key way of doing that is to build friendships, to build alliances. And a very significant recent development is obviously the quadrilateral security dialogue linking the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. And that's going to be a very important signal to China and indeed to the wider world that these four great democracies take freedom seriously and take the global rules-based order seriously. Now, the lesson of history is that the only thing dictatorships respect is strength. And I think it's very important for the free countries to have clear red lines and to make sure that these are not readily crossed. I think right now the front line of freedom is effectively Taiwan, and I think it's very important that we do everything we can to help strengthen Taiwan at this time. Personally, I think that a very important way to strengthen Taiwan and to acknowledge Taiwan would be to admit it into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Taiwan is a great trading economy. It respects the rule of law. It respects the global rules-based order. It would be a very welcome addition, I believe, to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But we all know that at some point in time, if China is true to its word, there will be an attempt to take back Taiwan. Obviously, China would prefer to win without a fight. It would prefer victory without war, but we cannot rule out very serious military conflict in East Asia. No one would want to fire the first shot. China would not want to fire the first shot. Taiwan and its friends would not want to fire the first shot. But with the kind of brinkmanship that we are seeing, which could possibly soon move to a higher level, including perhaps some kind of blockade, it might be very difficult to avoid. No one wants a conflict, but on the other hand, no one wants to see the crushing of a democracy of 25 million people, a place which has moved from a poverty-stricken dictatorship to a thriving, prosperous, liberal, pluralist democracy over the course of the last 7 decades. And of course, if one democracy is crushed, all are diminished, and the destruction of freedom in Taiwan would have very serious ramifications for freedom in South Korea and for freedom in Japan. But I do want to finish these remarks on an optimistic note. It's interesting, isn't it, that Chinese people with the ability to do so can't generally wait to get as much of their wealth as possible out of the country and to do their best to acquire Western passports for themselves or their children. So the people who know China best have a sense of its fragility and its vulnerability. While China is now acquiring massive hard power to go with its very, very considerable economic strength, it has almost no soft power compared particularly to countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. I think that whatever faults the United States and the other free democracies might have, whatever blots there might be on our history, we remain beacons of hope and optimism to billions of people around the world. And we need to remember that every time we find ourselves in a challenging situation with a ruthless dictatorship.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Very much appreciate those remarks and the note of optimism at the end, which I think we all need an injection of that, and remember our strengths and what we bring to the table in this competition. May I invite Chiyoko Goto to make some brief remarks, reaction, and comment to your keynote and her own thoughts. She is a great friend of this institute and has participated in previous webinars with us. As was said, she's the Deputy Director for Geoeconomics and Senior Northeast Asia Associate at the Woodrow Wilson Center. She's also a former journalist, so we have a theme going here, and also has degrees from Oxford University, so a couple of common strands here. Goto-san, please share your remarks, and look forward to hearing your views.
Well, Chairman Shriver, thank you very much for inviting me to this forum, and it's a great honor to be able to share the WebEx space with Prime Minister Abbott. I really want to keep my remarks short, but in response to the Prime Minister's focus on Taiwan and its economic development, I do want to point out that although we have welcomed this multi-layered strategy in pushing back against China. So we have, in addition to the existing partnerships and alliances in the Indo-Pacific, we have new partnerships in the form of the Quad as well as AUKUS appearing. There are a lot of concerns about some of the key issues that are not being adequately addressed. And one of them, the glaringly obvious one, would be the lack of economic leadership and a lack of answers to balancing economic relations and security concerns with China. So we've seen a boosting in defense capabilities and enhancing military partnerships. And of course, investing in infrastructure development across the Indo-Pacific is greatly needed, but it's not solving the immediate issue of confronting China as the region's economic hegemon. And coordinated efforts to preempt future economic coercion certainly are still lacking. And it's particularly noteworthy about Taiwan's precarious situation when it comes to economic security. As the Prime Minister noted, Taiwan has made this bid to join the CPTPP. And unlike China, which made that bid a week earlier, it's less driven by political posturing, but it really is essential for Taiwan's future survival as a robust democracy. Taiwan is clearly far more accession ready to the CPTPP than the PRC, but nevertheless, there will be economic reform that is politically unpopular with the Taiwanese voters that need to go ahead before it can be admitted, just as the conditions of being going on to the CPTPP. And of course, right now, the Taiwanese economy is doing very well. And the pandemic has certainly highlighted the needs for Taiwanese technology. But we are also aware about the longer term concerns about the competitive edge of Taiwan. And it needs to balance sharing its own technology capabilities and maintaining its own economic resilience. But as Taiwan is prepared to make these concessions and go ahead with reforms, it must be noted that this is a very politically challenging time for the ruling Democratic Progressive Party. I believe that in addition to for the CPTPP member countries, including Australia, as well as New Zealand, Japan, and other countries, to encourage and support Taiwan's bid to join the CPTPP, more can actually be done by Taiwan's allies and partners through increased direct investments and investing in human capital to bolster Taiwan's longer-term economic strengths, without which Taiwan will remain vulnerable to Chinese overtures and disinformation campaigns. One other thing I do want to note about some of the challenges of this multi-layered approach to partnerships is the submergence of separate spheres of trust amongst allies and partners. And what do I mean by that? So content aside, the rollout of the AUKUS strategy had been a diplomatic disappointment. It has led to questioning about the rhetoric of partnerships and the reality of some of the high-handedness or perhaps lack of appetite to keep communication channels open amongst Australia, United States, and UK allies. And it's also, to be quite frank, highlighted the persisting strength of the Anglosphere. For a country like Japan, which is really an anchor for the United States in engaging as a Pacific power, the AUKUS has actually raised more questions than giving answers, even though Tokyo has voiced support for AUKUS from the sidelines. The possibility of JOKUS, Japan joining the AUKUS, has been bandied about, but it's really quickly been dismissed, not just for domestic considerations within Japan due to Japan's own constitutional restrictions, but there's also the question of Japanese not necessarily needing nuclear submarines in its surrounding seas, and existing the diesel electric subs would actually be more effective for its purposes. But beyond that, it's also raised the question again in Tokyo about Japan not being part of the Five Eyes and persisting concerns about Tokyo's technology security capabilities. Under the recently appointed Prime Minister Kishida, Japan is expected to continue a hardline stance towards China, but also with a focus on economic security. There's been concerted efforts to bolster competitiveness in critical industries and protect its economic future, but it's also raised greater urgency for Japan to enhance its own risk management capabilities, both in the private as well as the public sectors, in order to remain a trusted partner. Of course, AUKUS is still a concept, but if it moves forward, part of its allure is this opportunity for technology cooperation and to jumpstart technology innovation between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Japan and other technologically advanced nations will want to be part of that, which will require greater trust in risk management and flexibility in dealing with the changing dynamics between the United States and China as security considerations become a bigger risk in the technology sector in particular. So let me leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Goto-san. I appreciate very much those thoughtful comments. Let me just make a few comments in reaction to Prime Minister Abbott's remarks and what Goto-san has also added. First of all, I think it's important to note that we are all rowing in the same direction, if you will. Sometimes the challenge at hand is getting strategic agreement, getting consensus about what the problems are and what the challenges are. I think what we've heard is we have very good consensus, including at the very top of our respective governments, about the nature of the challenge. So that's very good news. I think number two, having identified a consensus about the challenge, building out the infrastructure, if you will, the minilateral organizations, the way that we interact with one another to address the challenges is sometimes a problem. And here, I think what we're discussing is that much of that is coming together. We've got longstanding trilateral cooperation between Australia, Japan, and the United States. We obviously have the bilateral pieces between the US and Australia, US, and Japan, adding the Quad, adding AUKUS. So we're building out the government infrastructure, if you will, to strengthen our cooperation to address the challenges, as I said, which is one of a consensus view. So I think now the challenge is how do we implement the consensus given the architecture now at our disposal? What are the activities? What's the agenda? How do we cooperate with one another in meaningful ways so that we can uphold the free and open Indo-Pacific, which is the shared objective, and push back against China, which is seeking to undermine that? And I think what's been put on the table is quite useful. In our government, we're now talking more and more about integrated deterrence, that it's not just a military proposition to deter Chinese aggression and to deter Chinese military adventurism, but it's really the comprehensive tools of our national government and really in many cases of our civil society and our people. And I think we've heard that theme as well this afternoon. And it's something that we can do as individual countries, this integrated deterrence, but it's something we really need to do together in order to optimize the deterrent effect it will ultimately have on China. So these questions about our trading relationships, supply chain, our export controls, and how we manage all that will obviously be determined by individual capitals with work with their parliaments and the Diet in Japan's case, but we need to be synced up in that those endeavors as well. Leakage on export controls in one of the countries will hurt all of us, or gaps in terms of technology protection or cyber, whatever it may be, affects all of us. So as we go about this integrated deterrence, having very close coordination as we do so is extraordinarily important. Now, some of the challenges China will present may call for a division of labor of sorts. If you look at the Pacific Islands, we know our friends in Australia are very keen to ensure stability and proper governance in places like Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. The United States has special relationships with the freely associated states of the Marshall Islands, Palau, and the Federated States of Micronesia. But there are certain instances where it's really all hands on deck. And I appreciate the fact that both the previous speakers talked about Taiwan, because this is really, I think Prime Minister Abbott said, Taiwan is the front line of freedom right now. And that is a challenge that will require all of us working together in concerted ways to support Taiwan, whether that be in trade, as was mentioned with the TPP, whether that be on the military side, giving them confidence that they won't be acting alone in the event of an attack on China or other forms of coercion. But it also means building out Taiwan's international space, and there's ways that all three of us can help do that. That is the challenge among all that is really the all hands on deck challenge, and I think it was really gratifying to hear both my colleagues on this virtual panel endorse that idea as well. So much we can talk about. I just wanted to offer those brief reactions and comments. And I think now we can have a discussion, and I might lead it off with a question for Prime Minister Abbott. A lot of attention recently on AUKUS, but in particular the element of technology cooperation leading to a possible cooperative arrangement where Australia will acquire a nuclear submarine. I know you have some thoughts on this, and maybe even a way to bridge the gap between now and when a newly constructed submarine might enter the water in Australia. So I wonder if you can give us your thoughts on the requirement that Australia sees, how this capability will be useful to Australia, but also to your allies and partners, and how you might see a way of accelerating this type of cooperation.
Thanks very much, Randy. Look, I might just go to some of the things that Chihoko said, if I may, and if I can start with some of the trade issues and economic issues that you raised. I was sitting in the Australian Parliament as opposition leader back in 2011 when President Obama announced the tilt to the Pacific. And of course, the economic arm of the tilt to the Pacific was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think it is most unfortunate that domestic politics in the United States ultimately prevented the United States from being part of that which was its original conception. Australia and Japan are obviously enthusiastic members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I very much hope that, as well as admitting Taiwan pretty shortly, that the Trans-Pacific Partnership should go global with the admission of the United Kingdom. And I hope that the admission of the United Kingdom, which obviously is the second greatest centre of the Anglosphere, will lead to the United States rethinking, because it really should be involved, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership will be vastly more effective in every sense with the United States in it. Now, you know, it's interesting, Chihoko, when I first became Prime Minister, I immediately turned my attention to the question of Australia's future submarine deterrent. And my initial inclination was to get our future submarines built in Japan for a number of reasons. One of them because Japan has skin in the game in a way that none of the Europeans do. Japan's submarines are in a region which would be traversed by both Chinese and Russian nuclear submarines. I was confident that Japan would not put its submarines to sea in boats that weren't more than capable of taking on any potential adversary. And so I was very keen back in 2013 and 14 to establish a submarine partnership with Japan, which obviously would be the reality of a very, very strong strategic partnership, as well as simply a defence acquisition. So, look, I want the strongest possible partnership with Japan. I was very keen to see the closest possible relationship of trust and candour between our military and security establishments at the highest level. Certainly over the last couple of generations, our business establishments have developed a wonderful and respectful relationship of trust and partnership with so many people in Japan, and I wanted to see that extended. Now, I have every reason to think that my successors are doing that, and certainly I would like to see Japan effectively in the Five Eyes, because Japan would obviously bring enormous insights and capability to it. Now, you say that AUKUS has raised questions in Japan. I probably should point out something which maybe has been missed, and that is that the deal with the French had many exit ramps. That was part of the contract. So we haven't broken the contract. We have simply chosen to take one of the contractual exit ramps, and whatever obligations we have, financial obligations we have to the French naval group, obviously we will honour them, because we're certainly not in the business of playing dirty pool with anyone, particularly the French, with whom we've always had a very good relationship. And there are 46,000 Australian soldiers who lie buried in northern France because Australia rushed to the defence of France from 1915 until 1918, and we're conscious of what we did, and I think the people of France are conscious of what we did. And while I can understand the French being a little bit miffed, it is a blow to their pride, no doubt about that. I am very confident that the fundamental goodwill between the French and the Australian people will be unscathed by this. So, Randy, just remind me, what was I now to turn to? Because in my enthusiasm to respond to Shihoko, I can't remember the challenge you put to me.
I'm very glad you did respond, because those were excellent comments. And I was asking about the potential for a nuclear submarine and any possibility of expediting that and bridging the gap, and how you see this capability as helping Australia.
Okay, well, without boring people with too much detail about Australia's submarine program, our existing submarine fleet was originally planned to be phased out from the middle of the 2020s, so to start in about 5 years' time. We really need new submarines now, not in 10 or 20 years' time. And one of the things that I hope our government is exploring as a matter of extreme urgency would be the possibility of taking over retiring British or American nuclear submarines, if needs be, with a composite crew, and running them as, if you like, part training, part operational boats. If needs be, they could be based in Guam, because the sooner we have a much more substantial Australian sovereign capability in this field, absolutely the better for everyone.
Shihoko,
Yes.
Shihoko, please ask a question.
Yeah, so Prime Minister Abbott, thank you very much for hearing me out and for your response as well. If I may follow up, one of the challenges, of course, is to expand existing networks and strengthen partnerships. CPTPP is far more than a very highly ambitious trade agreement. It is also a political partnership. And here in the United States, really, the foreign policy community has focused much more on the benefits from a foreign policy perspective than as an economic agreement. In that light, as I said, Taiwan can qualify with some slight adjustments to join the CPTPP. But we are assuming that, similar to the situation under the WTO, that both the PRC and the ROC would have to join together to make it politically palatable. To what extent can Australia actually help avoid that trap, so that joining must be together with Beijing? Is it possible for that to move forward without the United States being in the CPTPP?
Well, thank you, Shihoko. Look, I don't believe China can join the TPP. First, because it's currently weaponising trade against Australia, and I don't believe any self-respecting Australian government could support the admission of China to the Trans-Pacific Partnership while some $20 billion worth of our trade is being capriciously and arbitrarily disrupted for political purposes by the Beijing government. So that's the first reason. Second reason is that in order to have a highly ambitious free trade area, all of its members have got to subscribe to the rule of law, at least insofar as it applies to these commercial relationships. And plainly, there is no rule of law in China. There's the rule of party in China. So I think it's really a fundamental problem with the way the Chinese economy works, which makes it almost impossible for it to join any fair income partnership of this sort. I mean, what we have discovered over the last 20 years or so, since China joined the WTO, is that it has taken advantage of the rules without really playing by them. That's the reality. We've seen a great deal of intellectual theft. We've seen a great deal of hidden subsidization and so on. Well, maybe you could turn a blind eye to that when we thought China was on, if you like, a converging path. Maybe we could turn a blind eye to that when a happy byproduct of that was access to cheap and decent consumer goods. But now that we are seeing China come right out into the open, using trade as, if you like, politics by other means, strategy by other means, I just don't think there's any way China can be admitted.
Thank you very much. I think that's a rejection of the WTO model, as they call it, where Taiwan qualified first but had to wait for Beijing's entrance. And I think that would be supported here in the United States as well, taking Taiwan on its own merits. I know we have audience questions that have been piling up, and so I'm going to turn to my colleague, Ms. Hong, to help field those questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we have several questions lined up here. So I will start with the first one. It's from Anna Volushina and from the Institute of Far Eastern Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and Russell Shao from the Global Taiwan Institute asked a very similar question, so we'll combine them together. Last month, Defense Minister Peter Dutton claimed that he did not rule out the possibility of Australian military confrontation with the PLA in the case of a war outbreak in the Taiwan Strait. What is your point of view on the issue, and what role do you see Australia potentially playing in responding to this contingency?
Well, I'm going to make 2 points. The first point is that as a democracy of 25 million people, Australia can hardly be indifferent to the fate of another democracy of almost 25 million people. While Taiwan is I suppose about a 10-hour flight away from Australia, it is a like-minded society. It is a free and liberal society which has evolved magnificently in the last few decades, and is a living, breathing refutation of the idea that there is some totalitarian gene in the Chinese DNA. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that no country has been a more dependable ally of the United States than mine. We have been involved in every conflict in which the United States has participated. And under the ANZUS Treaty, in the event of an attack on either of our countries or their armed forces, we will act together to meet the common danger. So I think you can assume that where America is involved, Australia will be involved.
Okay. And this question is inspired from a live comment from Daniel Koo. How can the UN work to keep China from invading and annexing Taiwan? Is this not part of the UN's mission? How can democratic nations around the world work together to protect Taiwan from authoritarian China? And I think I'm going to combine that question also with Tina Chung from Voice of America China branch, also asking, how can Washington and its allies in Indo-Pacific do to help escalate tension and prevent accidents or miscalculations?
Is this for me?
It's for
is that
everyone,
question? Yeah. Okay, well, maybe if Shihoko goes first.
I'm going to pass it over to Randy.
Thank you. If the questioner literally meant the UN organization, I'm afraid the UN's role is quite limited given China's position as a permanent member of the Security Council, one of the Perm Five. So they have a lot of sway over the actions of the United Nations, and they've successfully prevented consideration of Taiwan issues, even Taiwan's membership in UN-affiliated organizations. So I think if the question is literally what can the United Nations do, it's pretty limited. I think in terms of de-escalation, mitigating risk, I think the urgent matter right now is to shore up and regain deterrence. I think right now we've had a lot of buildup from China, a lot of capabilities coming online, them exercising those capabilities in very provocative ways. So we need to regain deterrence through our own shows of will and support for Taiwan. But also, we do need the mechanisms to try to communicate effectively with China. No, as Prime Minister Abbott said, nobody wants a war. We certainly don't want a war that we stumble into through an incident or accident. So I know my time at the Department of Defense, we spent a lot of time talking to the PLA about crisis management, crisis communication, try to keep the operational environment as safe as possible. Of course, it takes two to tango, and so we can ask for it, and we can even build some of these modalities. They don't have a great history of working when we need them most, but I think it's worthy of our effort because we don't want to stumble into something unintended that escalates quickly. So I think paying attention to both sides of that equation, the deterrent side with Taiwan and with our partners and allies, but also keeping lines of communication open with the Chinese side so that we don't stumble into a horrible mess.
If I can just add, as an aside, the idea of keeping Taiwan out of international organizations has become very much a sport almost on the part of Beijing. And in any situation, whether it's regarding security concerns or right now when we see a pandemic that continues to rage across the world at a time when Taiwan has really stepped up to be part of the solution and actually not part of the problem. We have a great deal to learn from Taiwan, being part of that international community. And so in addition to pushing for Taiwan to join things like the CPTPP and trade agreements, I think this actually opens another opportunity for us to reconsider how we allow memberships into international organizations, including the United Nations.
Just very briefly, look, I think that the West broadly has abundantly demonstrated over the last 3 decades its goodwill towards China. We admitted China to the WTO, even though it was never really a market economy. We bent over backwards to try to accommodate and welcome China. We've all welcomed the rise of China, and let's face it, lifting about 500 million people from the third world to the middle class in scarcely a generation is indeed admirable, and we should pay credit to the Chinese government and people to that extent. But nevertheless, what surely must now be obvious to Beijing is that if you are decent and respectful to us, we will be at least as decent and respectful to you. But there's no decency and respect coming from Beijing right now. And the sooner there is something that more closely resembles the immediate post-Deng Xiaoping approach, the better for everyone.
Okay. This question is from Gabe Palathi from Whitmer Worrell. In the United States, there is a desire to launch new talks with China, but existing tariffs will remain in place. How should U.S. and Australian companies be thinking about the trading relationship with China?
Do you want to go first, Randy?
Well, sure. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. I'll start on the U.S. side. I think our ambitions should be well in check, given the history of trade negotiations with China, and more to the point, the poor history of implementation of said agreements on the Chinese side. But look, it's a major market for us, even with some decoupling. It's a large market, and we want access to that in non-sensitive areas. So I don't object to talking to the Chinese about these matters, but I do think our companies and our businesses need to think about not only bottom line, which I know our private sector is really driven to do, but really to think about the long term. What does it mean to be vulnerable, to have your intellectual property vulnerable, to have in many ways your people vulnerable increasingly? And so I know a lot of companies, depending on the sector, market forces have started to drive them into Southeast Asia, great trading partners such as Vietnam and in South Asia, India, Bangladesh. But I think companies would be wise to accelerate that on their own initiative rather than waiting to be forced, either from the Chinese side, which themselves are, and Xi Jinping driving some decoupling and some anti-capitalist kind of maneuvers, but more to the point, if it comes from our government due to concerns over our trade practices strengthening China through civil military fusion programs and the like, I would like to see many instances of our companies taking the initiative and looking for diversification themselves. Otherwise, I think our government will step in, and particularly in the more sensitive areas.
Right. Look, I'm very much in favour of Australian businesses continuing to sell as much as they can, including to China, provided they're not making China any stronger than it already is militarily, and provided they understand that their intellectual property could well be purloined. But I would suggest very much that any business which doesn't want to be subject to capricious disruption should not have China playing a critical role in their supply chain. And finally, I'd just say, yes, business people have to make a profit, of course, but business is not just about making a profit. Business people are citizens as well, and I'd like to think that they'd be patriotic citizens who want their country to flourish. And right now, there is a strategic competition going on, and it's important that we make our country stronger vis-a-vis this particular competitor.
If I can just add, so USTR announced its latest China trade policy earlier this month. And it was actually surprising insofar as there were a lot of similarities and carryovers from the Trump administration, especially with the decision not to lift any tariffs towards China, and that there would be tariff exemptions for the United States, US companies that have been hurt by the tariffs on the Chinese goods. So we are seeing that the United States is continuing this very hawkish stance. Now, whether that, what is the collateral damage of that from the corporate side that is a very difficult question that remains to be answered. But I do know that when we talk about supply chain and supply chain resiliency, until recently, it had really focused on the bottom line, on efficiency, on cost-cutting measures. Now, the slogan now is moving away from just-in-time production to just-in-case, right? So you want to have resources closer to you physically. You also want to depend on partners that are closer to you in an ideological perspective, so that companies are not so vulnerable to the politicization or weaponization of critical supplies. So we are changing the sea change in trade policy and trade dynamics. But for a lot of the private sector companies, it is a very challenging time because oftentimes the tariffs in particular are still drawn in the sand, and it is very difficult for them to make longer term investment decisions.
Okay. We have this question from Kyle Ballard, Raytheon Technologies. One huge announcement following the Australia-US ministerial that was somewhat eclipsed by the sub-deal was the bilateral agreement with the United States on increased rotational deployments, enhanced cooperation on logistics and sustainment, maritime and air cooperation. Is this simply a small step toward a larger vision? And if so, where do you see the relationship in 10 years?
Yes, Jennifer, is that the relationship between Australia and the United States?
Yes.
Well, look, it is probably one of the most intimate strategic and military partnerships in the world, if not the most intimate strategic and military partnership, along with that between the United States and the United Kingdom. So I see this relationship getting stronger and stronger because not only are we almost completely like-minded, but I think that the challenges that we face are becoming more intense. And when you are facing an intense challenge, that's when you need your friends around you. So I think the relationship is just going to get stronger over coming decades.
Yeah, I just add, even the strongest of alliances can still improve and evolve and adapt. And everything Prime Minister Abbott said about the strength of our alliance is true. The history, we fought alongside one another in every war, every conflict, all that is true. But, it was only recent that we had this persistent rotational presence in Darwin. We haven't had bases in Australia, and letter of the law, we still don't. But to the untrained eye, persistent rotations look a little bit like bases. But I think getting to 2,500 in Darwin was a breakthrough, and it proved to both sides that having that kind of presence strengthens the alliance in a lot of ways. We train with one another, but we also are somewhat expeditionary. We take that training opportunity and engage Indonesia, engage other partners in the near abroad from Darwin. I think the vision was always to expand as the alliance would allow for in terms of the pace and scope. Those training opportunities are very valuable to the United States, but it also creates the interoperability, creates that opportunity to use it for engagement of others. And I think this will be a part of our alliance going forward, and it may be incremental in terms of how we really proceed in terms of having more rotations and more presence, but it's absolutely the right direction, and I think will only strengthen our ability to operate with one another in other places that are of mutual concern to us.
Okay, this question is from Kevin from the Department of Defense. According to a recent Chicago Council survey, Americans are more supportive of deepening the nation's political and economic ties with Taiwan than ever before. Has there been a similar shift in public opinion among Australians, and how might this expand or limit Canberra's strategic policy options with respect to Taiwan moving forward? And I think I would like to add Japan as well, just the public opinion in Japan as well.
Shoko, do you want to go first?
So as I said at the beginning of this conversation, Japan has just had a new prime minister appointed. Of course, there will be a general election at the end of the month, but the expectations are that Kishida will remain prime minister. He has strong personal connections to Taiwan. There is an expectation of continuum of Japan to continue to be supportive of Taiwan. And I say that in part because not just because of Kishida's own personal background, but also because he is having the critical posts of defense and foreign ministers unchanged from the previous administration as well, which had adopted this strident approach towards China and much has invested in publicly supporting Taiwan as well. And that has actually echoed into Japanese public opinion as well. And I should point out that geographically, Taiwan is just very close geographically to Japan. Culturally, they're very close as well. You walk down the streets of Taipei, it's a very familiar feeling for someone from Tokyo to go to Taipei. It's kind of the same, but in different language. And so there's always been this kind of grassroots people-to-people connection. And at the same time, we are seeing this at all levels of government, including at the highest level.
Look, we've certainly seen a dramatic shift in public attitudes towards China. 5 or 6 years ago, Australian public opinion was overwhelmingly benign towards China. Now it's overwhelmingly skeptical and worried and anxious about China. I'm not sure that we've done public opinion polling in respect of Taiwan, but certainly Australians have got the message that as far as we're concerned, in the words of an official Chinese spokesman, we are chewing gum on China's boot.
Right, this will be the last question. It is a big one, but I think that wraps up our webinar very well. And this is from Doug Greenlaw from Research Innovations, Inc. What advice would you give to the U.S. leaders in the context of preparation to ensure that Republic of China remains an independent democratic entity?
Well, look, politicians from one country should be a little bit careful about giving public advice to politicians from another country, even if we're close friends and intimate partners. I just want America to be brave. I know America is good, but I want America to be brave. Now, I know that the American people and leadership sometimes tire of the burdens that they have carried these past 70 years, magnificently carried, if I may say, for the last 70 years, to the enormous benefit of the wider world. Never before in history, notwithstanding our current challenges, both in a health and in a strategic sense, never before in human history have so many people been so prosperous and so free. And that is in large measure thanks to the burdens that the United States has borne and the inspiration that the United States has given over the last 7 decades. And the point that I always tried to make in Washington and elsewhere is that if you ever do flag or fail, we in Australia will do our best to sustain you as much as we possibly can.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister Abbott. On behalf of Project 2049, we just want to thank you, Goto-san, and also all of you who are joining us today. And we hope you will tune in again in the future.